The ancient halls of the Palazzo Vecchio in Florence bore witness to countless schemes, betrayals, and the rise and fall of powers that once seemed eternal. It was here, in the shadow of political upheaval, that Niccolò Machiavelli first understood a fundamental truth about human nature and the exercise of power. Those who master themselves through strategic patience often achieve victory not through direct confrontation, but by allowing their enemies to destroy themselves through their own weaknesses. In the spring of 1503, as Machiavelli observed the machinations surrounding Cesare Borgia's campaigns, he witnessed a profound demonstration of strategic patience in action. Borgia, despite his reputation for swift and brutal action, understood that his greatest victories came not from immediate aggression, but from creating conditions where his enemies would make fatal errors while he remained positioned to capitalize on their mistakes. This principle would become central to Machiavellian thought, the art of winning through calculated inaction and the deliberate cultivation of one's own inner strength while others succumb to their inherent weaknesses. The concept of strategic patience extends far beyond mere waiting or passive observation. It represents a sophisticated understanding of timing, self-control, and the psychological dynamics that govern human behavior in competitive environments. When Machiavelli wrote that the man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others, he was articulating a fundamental principle of power that transcends the political realm and applies to every aspect of human endeavor where success depends on outlasting, outmaneuvering, or simply outliving one's competition. Strategic patience requires the practitioner to develop an almost supernatural level of self-awareness and emotional regulation. The weak self that must be destroyed encompasses all those impulses, desires, and psychological vulnerabilities that lead to premature action, emotional decision-making, and the surrender of long-term advantage for short-term satisfaction. This destruction is not a one-time event but an ongoing process of refinement and strengthening that transforms the practitioner into someone capable of maintaining clarity and purpose even when surrounded by chaos and uncertainty. Consider the case of Lorenzo de' Medici, whose approach to managing the volatile political landscape of 15th-century Florence exemplified strategic patience in its most refined form. When faced with the Pazzi conspiracy in 1478, Lorenzo's response demonstrated how the destruction of one's weak self enables strategic thinking even in moments of extreme peril. Rather than immediately seeking revenge or responding with the violent retaliation that his emotional state might have demanded, Lorenzo carefully analyzed the political dynamics at play, identified the true sources of threat, and methodically worked to isolate his enemies while building stronger alliances with potential supporters. The psychological foundation of strategic patience rests on the understanding that most human failures stem from internal weaknesses rather than external pressures. Impatience, emotional reactivity, the need for immediate gratification, the inability to tolerate uncertainty, and the tendency to mistake activity for progress are the primary enemies of strategic thinking. These weaknesses create predictable patterns of behavior that the patient strategist can exploit without ever having to engage in direct confrontation. When Machiavelli observed the political landscape of his time, he noticed that the most successful leaders were not necessarily the most aggressive or the most immediately capable, but those who could maintain their composure and strategic focus while their rivals exhausted themselves through overextension, emotional decisions, and the inability to distinguish between what was urgent and what was truly important. This observation led him to develop a framework for understanding power that prioritized psychological strength over physical force and long-term positioning over short-term advantage. The first element of strategic patience involves the cultivation of emotional detachment from immediate outcomes. This does not mean becoming indifferent or passive, but rather developing the ability to maintain one's strategic objectives even when faced with setbacks, provocations, or opportunities that might tempt one toward premature action. The strategically patient individual learns to view each development, whether positive or negative, as simply another data point in a larger pattern rather than as a cause for immediate emotional response. This emotional detachment enables a form of strategic thinking that is impossible when one is reactive to immediate circumstances. Instead of being pulled into the emotional rhythms of conflict or competition, the patient strategist maintains a broader perspective that allows for the recognition of patterns and opportunities that are invisible to those caught up in the immediate dynamics of any given situation. This perspective advantage often proves decisive, as it enables the patient strategist to position themselves favorably for developments that others cannot anticipate. The second crucial element involves the deliberate cultivation of systems and processes that operate independently of one's immediate emotional state or external pressures. Rather than relying on inspiration, motivation, or favorable circumstances to drive action, strategic patience requires the development of consistent practices and decision-making frameworks that function effectively regardless of external conditions. This systematic approach ensures that temporary setbacks or emotional challenges do not derail long-term strategic objectives. These systems often appear deceptively simple but require tremendous discipline to maintain consistently. They might include regular periods of reflection and analysis, predetermined criteria for decision-making, established processes for gathering and evaluating information, and clear protocols for responding to various types of challenges or opportunities. The power of these systems lies not in their complexity but in their ability to maintain strategic clarity even when emotions, external pressures, or immediate circumstances might otherwise cloud judgment. The third fundamental aspect of strategic patience involves learning to distinguish between different types of action and understanding when inaction itself becomes a form of strategic intervention. Many individuals and organizations fail because they cannot tolerate the psychological discomfort of appearing inactive, even when patient observation and preparation would serve their long-term interests far better than immediate action. The ability to resist this pressure while continuing to gather intelligence, strengthen one's position, and wait for more favorable conditions often proves decisive in competitive environments. This distinction between productive action and mere activity requires a sophisticated understanding of cause and effect in complex systems. The strategically patient individual learns to identify the leverage points where small, well-timed actions can produce disproportionate results, while avoiding the temptation to engage in activities that create the illusion of progress without actually advancing strategic objectives. This often means accepting short-term criticism or misunderstanding from those who mistake visible activity for effective strategy. The historical record provides numerous examples of leaders and organizations that achieved remarkable success through the application of strategic patience, often in situations where more aggressive approaches had failed repeatedly. The rise of the Medici banking empire, for instance, was built not on dramatic gestures or rapid expansion, but on the patient accumulation of influence, the careful cultivation of relationships across multiple generations, and the systematic development of financial instruments and practices that created sustainable competitive advantages over time. Similarly, the political strategies that allowed various Italian city-states to maintain their independence despite being surrounded by larger and seemingly more powerful neighbors often relied on strategic patience rather than military might. These smaller powers learned to position themselves as valuable allies rather than threatening enemies, to exploit the conflicts between larger powers rather than challenging them directly, and to build the kind of institutional stability that could outlast the individual ambitions of any particular leader or faction. The psychological challenges of implementing strategic patience cannot be understated. Human beings are naturally inclined toward immediate action when faced with threats or opportunities, and the social and cultural pressures in most competitive environments tend to reward visible activity over patient preparation. Overcoming these natural inclinations requires not only intellectual understanding but also the development of new emotional and psychological habits that support long-term thinking even in high-pressure situations. One of the most significant challenges involves learning to tolerate the uncertainty and apparent vulnerability that often accompany strategic patience. When one refrains from immediate action in favor of longer-term positioning, there are inevitably periods when it appears that opportunities are being missed or that more aggressive competitors are gaining ground. The ability to maintain confidence in one's strategic approach during these periods often determines whether strategic patience will ultimately prove effective or whether the practitioner will abandon their approach in favor of more immediately gratifying but strategically inferior alternatives. The cultivation of strategic patience also requires developing new ways of measuring progress and success that are not dependent on immediate external validation. Traditional metrics often fail to capture the value of patient positioning, careful preparation, or the avoidance of costly mistakes that strategic patience helps prevent. Learning to recognize and appreciate these less visible forms of progress helps maintain motivation and commitment to patient strategies even when they do not produce immediate, measurable results. Another crucial psychological element involves developing the ability to find satisfaction and engagement in the process of strategic thinking itself, rather than requiring constant external stimulation or validation. The strategically patient individual often spends significant periods in observation, analysis, and preparation that may appear boring or unproductive to those accustomed to more active approaches. Learning to find intellectual and emotional satisfaction in these activities is essential for maintaining strategic patience over extended periods. The relationship between strategic patience and timing represents one of the most sophisticated aspects of this approach to power and competition. Effective strategic patience is never about indefinite delay or passive waiting, but rather about developing the ability to recognize and act upon optimal moments for intervention. This requires not only patience but also acute sensitivity to changing conditions and the readiness to move decisively when circumstances align favorably. Understanding optimal timing often depends on recognizing patterns in the behavior of competitors or opponents that indicate moments of vulnerability or opportunity. These patterns might include periods when rivals are overextended, distracted by internal conflicts, or committed to courses of action that will prove unsustainable. The strategically patient individual learns to position themselves to take advantage of these moments while avoiding the temptation to act prematurely when conditions are not yet favorable. The concept of timing in strategic patience also involves understanding the natural rhythms and cycles that govern different types of competitive environments. Just as successful farmers learn to work with seasonal patterns rather than against them, effective strategists learn to align their actions with the underlying dynamics of their particular field rather than attempting to force outcomes through sheer effort or willpower. This alignment often produces results that appear effortless to outside observers but actually reflect deep understanding and careful preparation. The second major dimension of strategic patience involves understanding how to position oneself advantageously while allowing competitors to exhaust themselves through their own actions. This principle recognizes that in many competitive situations, the greatest threats to one's success come not from external opponents but from the tendency to waste resources, energy, and opportunities through poor strategic choices. By maintaining discipline and focus while others make costly mistakes, the patient strategist often emerges victorious without having to engage in direct confrontation. This approach requires developing a sophisticated understanding of how different types of competitive behavior tend to unfold over time. Aggressive competitors often achieve early advantages through speed and intensity but frequently struggle to maintain their effectiveness over extended periods. Emotional competitors may be formidable in the short term but tend to make costly errors when their emotional states fluctuate. Understanding these patterns allows the strategic patient practitioner to position themselves to benefit from the inevitable consequences of unsustainable approaches. The key to successfully implementing this aspect of strategic patience lies in learning to maintain one's own strategic focus while resisting the temptation to mirror the competitive behaviors of others. When faced with aggressive or emotional competitors, the natural human tendency is to respond in kind, escalating the intensity of competition in ways that often prove costly to all involved. Strategic patience requires the discipline to maintain one's own approach even when it appears that others are gaining temporary advantages through different methods. This discipline often involves accepting short-term disadvantages or apparent setbacks in service of long-term positioning. The strategically patient individual may appear to be losing ground in the immediate term, but their consistent approach and careful resource management often prove superior when competitors begin to experience the consequences of their less sustainable approaches. This dynamic requires tremendous psychological strength, as it demands maintaining confidence in one's strategy even when external appearances might suggest that alternative approaches are more effective. The practice of allowing others to fail while maintaining one's own strategic integrity also involves developing skills in what might be called strategic invisibility. Rather than drawing attention to their superior positioning or highlighting the mistakes of competitors, effective practitioners of strategic patience often work to remain relatively unnoticed while others exhaust themselves in more visible conflicts. This invisibility provides protection from becoming a target while also allowing for more accurate observation of competitive dynamics. Strategic invisibility does not mean being passive or uninvolved, but rather learning to influence outcomes without becoming the obvious source of that influence. This might involve supporting certain developments without taking credit, providing subtle guidance without appearing to direct events, or creating conditions that encourage competitors to make poor choices without appearing to manipulate them. The effectiveness of this approach often depends on competitors being so focused on their immediate concerns that they fail to recognize the longer-term positioning of more patient players. The cultivation of allies and strategic relationships represents another crucial element of this approach. While allowing competitors to fail through their own actions, the strategic patient practitioner simultaneously works to build networks of support and cooperation that will prove valuable when opportunities for advancement arise. These relationships are often developed slowly and carefully, with attention to providing genuine value rather than seeking immediate advantage. Effective relationship building in the context of strategic patience involves understanding the long-term interests and motivations of potential allies rather than focusing solely on immediate transactional benefits. This deeper understanding allows for the development of more durable and mutually beneficial connections that can withstand the temporary pressures and conflicts that inevitably arise in competitive environments. Such relationships often prove decisive when the time comes to capitalize on the failures of less patient competitors. The intelligence-gathering aspects of strategic patience deserve particular attention, as the effectiveness of this approach often depends on maintaining superior information about competitive dynamics, emerging trends, and the hidden weaknesses of apparent competitors. Patient strategists typically develop sophisticated systems for collecting, analyzing, and acting upon information that provides strategic advantages without revealing their own intentions or capabilities. This intelligence-gathering process often involves learning to recognize early warning signs of competitive vulnerabilities that may not become obvious until much later. Patterns of overextension, internal conflicts, resource constraints, or strategic contradictions may be visible to careful observers long before they manifest as obvious failures. Developing the ability to recognize these patterns while they are still subtle provides tremendous advantages in timing and positioning. The information gathering required for effective strategic patience also involves understanding the psychological and emotional patterns of key competitors. Different personality types tend to fail in predictable ways when placed under various types of pressure or when pursuing certain types of strategies. Learning to recognize these patterns allows for more accurate predictions about how competitive situations will develop over time and enables more effective positioning to benefit from the inevitable consequences of unsustainable approaches. Perhaps most importantly, this intelligence-gathering process must include honest and ongoing assessment of one's own strengths, weaknesses, and vulnerabilities. Strategic patience is only effective when it is based on realistic understanding of one's own capabilities and limitations. Self-deception about these factors can lead to patient waiting for opportunities that will never arise or failing to recognize when strategic patience should give way to more active approaches. The third and, perhaps most profound dimension of strategic patience involves the systematic transformation of one's own character and capabilities to eliminate the internal weaknesses that typically lead to strategic failure. This process represents the deepest level of the practice, as it addresses not merely tactical or strategic considerations but the fundamental psychological and emotional patterns that determine success or failure in competitive environments. The weak self that must be destroyed encompasses all those aspects of personality and character that create vulnerability to manipulation, emotional manipulation, or strategic error. These might include the need for immediate gratification, susceptibility to flattery or provocation, the inability to tolerate uncertainty or criticism, attachment to particular outcomes rather than underlying principles, and the tendency to make decisions based on fear, anger, or other emotional states rather than clear strategic thinking. This process of self-transformation is often more challenging than any external competition, as it requires confronting and changing deeply ingrained patterns of thought and behavior that may have developed over many years. Unlike external competitors, these internal weaknesses cannot be defeated through superior strategy or better positioning but must be addressed through patient and consistent work on one's own psychological and emotional development. The elimination of internal weaknesses often begins with developing greater self-awareness about the specific patterns that create vulnerability in strategic situations. This might involve recognizing triggers that lead to emotional decision-making, identifying the types of situations or personalities that tend to compromise one's strategic clarity, or understanding the ways in which personal insecurities or desires can be exploited by sophisticated opponents. Once these patterns are recognized, the process of transformation involves developing alternative responses that serve strategic objectives rather than immediate emotional needs. This often requires practicing new behaviors in low-stakes situations until they become natural responses, gradually building the psychological strength and emotional regulation needed to maintain strategic clarity even under significant pressure. The development of emotional regulation represents a particularly crucial aspect of this transformation. Strategic patience requires the ability to maintain clear thinking and purposeful action even when faced with stress, uncertainty, provocation, or apparent setbacks. This emotional regulation is not about suppressing emotions but rather about preventing emotional states from overwhelming strategic judgment or driving counterproductive actions. Effective emotional regulation in strategic contexts often involves developing what might be called emotional intelligence about timing. This means learning to recognize when emotional states are providing useful information about strategic situations and when they are creating noise that interferes with clear thinking. It also involves developing the ability to delay emotional responses until there is time for more careful consideration of their strategic implications. The cultivation of psychological resilience represents another essential element of this self-transformation process. Strategic patience often involves enduring periods of apparent disadvantage, criticism, or setback while maintaining confidence in one's long-term approach. This resilience must be deep enough to withstand not only external pressures but also internal doubts and the natural human tendency to seek immediate validation or relief from uncertainty. Building this resilience often involves developing a more sophisticated understanding of failure and setback as natural and potentially valuable elements of strategic development rather than as threats to one's self-worth or evidence of strategic inadequacy. This perspective allows for learning from mistakes without being derailed by them and for maintaining long-term focus even when short-term results are disappointing. The development of intellectual humility represents a paradoxical but essential aspect of the strength required for strategic patience. Recognizing the limits of one's knowledge and the complexity of competitive environments helps prevent the overconfidence that often leads to premature action or strategic error. At the same time, this humility must be balanced with sufficient confidence to act decisively when the time is right. This intellectual humility often involves developing comfort with uncertainty and ambiguity rather than seeking premature clarity or control. Strategic situations are typically complex and dynamic, with multiple variables that cannot be fully predicted or controlled. Learning to navigate this uncertainty while maintaining strategic focus requires a sophisticated balance between confidence and humility that allows for adaptation without abandoning core principles. The practice of strategic patience also requires developing new definitions of strength and power that are not dependent on immediate dominance or control over others. Traditional concepts of power often emphasize the ability to force immediate compliance or to achieve rapid victory over opponents. Strategic patience, by contrast, recognizes that the most durable forms of power often develop slowly and may not be immediately visible to outside observers. This redefinition of power often involves learning to find satisfaction and confidence in the process of strategic development itself rather than requiring constant external validation of one's effectiveness. The strategic patient individual learns to measure progress in terms of increasing capability, improving positioning, and growing influence rather than immediate victories or the defeat of particular opponents. The long-term effectiveness of strategic patience often depends on developing what might be called compound strategic advantages that grow stronger over time rather than diminishing with use. These advantages might include deep expertise in particular domains, extensive networks of relationships and influence, superior information gathering capabilities, or psychological and emotional resources that remain effective even under extended pressure. Building these compound advantages requires understanding how small, consistent actions can accumulate over time to create significant strategic advantages. Like compound interest in financial contexts, strategic patience often produces its most significant results through the accumulation of modest advantages over extended periods rather than through dramatic single actions or decisions. The integration of strategic patience into one's overall approach to life and work often involves developing new rhythms and practices that support long-term thinking and development. This might include regular periods of reflection and strategic analysis, systematic approaches to skill development and knowledge acquisition, and practices that maintain psychological and emotional resilience over extended periods. These supporting practices are often as important as the strategic thinking itself, as they provide the foundation that allows for sustained implementation of patient strategies even when external pressures or internal doubts might otherwise lead to abandonment of the approach. The development of these practices requires treating strategic patience not as an occasional tactic but as a fundamental approach to engaging with competitive and challenging environments. The ultimate goal of this transformation is to develop what might be called strategic invulnerability, not in the sense of being immune to all setbacks or challenges, but in the sense of possessing the internal resources and capabilities needed to navigate any competitive environment effectively. This invulnerability comes not from avoiding all risks or challenges but from developing the psychological, emotional, and strategic resources needed to turn challenges into opportunities and setbacks into sources of learning and growth. Strategic invulnerability also involves developing the ability to remain focused on one's own development and strategic objectives rather than being constantly reactive to the actions or apparent advantages of competitors. This internal focus allows for more consistent progress and reduces the likelihood of being drawn into competitive dynamics that serve others' interests rather than one's own strategic objectives. The historical examples of leaders and organizations that successfully implemented strategic patience often demonstrate how this approach can produce results that appear almost effortless to outside observers but actually reflect years or even decades of patient preparation and development. The rise of certain business empires, the success of particular political movements, and the achievements of individual leaders often follow patterns that illustrate the profound effectiveness of strategic patience when implemented with skill and consistency. These historical examples also demonstrate that strategic patience is not merely about individual advantage but can serve broader purposes, including the development of more stable and sustainable forms of organization and leadership. When leaders and organizations develop the internal strength and external positioning that characterize strategic patience, they often create value and opportunities for others rather than simply extracting advantage from competitive situations. The contemporary applications of strategic patience extend far beyond traditional political or business contexts to include virtually any situation where long-term success depends on outlasting, outmaneuvering, or simply outliving sources of opposition or challenge. These applications might include career development, relationship building, creative endeavors, social change, personal development, or any other domain where immediate approaches often prove less effective than patient, strategic development. In professional contexts, strategic patience often involves building expertise and relationships over time rather than seeking immediate advancement or recognition. This approach frequently produces more sustainable career development and greater long-term influence than strategies focused on short-term gains or competitive advantage over colleagues. In creative endeavors, strategic patience involves developing skills and understanding over extended periods rather than seeking immediate success or recognition. Many of the most significant creative achievements result from years or decades of patient development that may not produce visible results until relatively late in the process. In social and political contexts, strategic patience often involves building broad-based support and understanding rather than seeking immediate policy victories or changes. The most enduring social changes often result from patient work to shift underlying attitudes and assumptions rather than from confrontational approaches that may produce immediate attention but limited lasting impact. The practice of strategic patience requires ongoing refinement and adaptation as one gains experience and as external conditions change. What works in one context or at one stage of development may need modification as capabilities grow and as competitive environments evolve. This ongoing adaptation requires maintaining the fundamental principles of strategic patience while remaining flexible about specific tactics and approaches. The psychological and emotional rewards of strategic patience often become more apparent with practice and experience. While the approach may initially feel frustrating or constraining to those accustomed to more immediate forms of gratification, successful practitioners often discover that strategic patience provides deeper and more lasting satisfaction than approaches focused on short-term advantage or immediate gratification. These rewards include not only the material and positional advantages that strategic patience often produces but also the personal development and psychological strength that result from successfully implementing this approach. The individual who masters strategic patience often finds that they have simultaneously developed capabilities and perspectives that enhance virtually every aspect of their life and work. The teaching and transmission of strategic patience to others represents both an opportunity and a responsibility for those who have successfully implemented this approach. Unlike tactical or technical knowledge, strategic patience involves psychological and emotional development that cannot be simply explained or demonstrated but must be cultivated through practice and experience. Effective teaching of strategic patience often involves creating environments and opportunities where others can discover through their own experience the advantages of patient approaches over more immediate alternatives. This might involve mentoring relationships, organizational cultures that reward long-term thinking, or educational approaches that emphasize process and development over immediate results. The broader implications of widespread adoption of strategic patience extend to questions about how societies and institutions might function differently if these approaches became more common. Organizations and societies that emphasize strategic patience often demonstrate greater stability, more sustainable development, and better long-term outcomes than those focused primarily on short-term competition or immediate gratification. The vision of leadership and success that emerges from the practice of strategic patience offers an alternative to more conventional approaches that often emphasize dominance, speed, or immediate advantage. This alternative vision suggests that the most effective and sustainable forms of leadership often develop slowly and may not be immediately apparent to outside observers but prove their worth through consistent effectiveness over extended periods. The integration of strategic patience with other forms of knowledge and skill creates possibilities for effectiveness and influence that exceed what any single approach might produce. When combined with technical expertise, creative capability, or specialized knowledge, strategic patience often amplifies the effectiveness of these other capabilities by ensuring they are applied at optimal times and in optimal ways. The future development of strategic patience as both an individual practice and a broader cultural approach remains an open question with significant implications for how competitive environments might evolve. As the pace of change continues to accelerate in many domains, the ability to maintain strategic focus and patient development may become even more valuable as a source of stability and effectiveness. The ultimate significance of strategic patience lies not merely in its effectiveness as a competitive approach but in its potential to transform both individuals and organizations in ways that create value and opportunity rather than simply extracting advantage from existing situations. When practiced with skill and consistency, strategic patience often produces results that benefit not only the practitioner but also broader communities and environments. The journey toward mastering strategic patience represents one of the most challenging and rewarding forms of personal and professional development available to those willing to undertake the patient work required. Like other forms of mastery, it requires sustained effort over extended periods, but the rewards, both immediate and long-term, often exceed what more conventional approaches to competition and achievement can provide. In the end, the principle that the man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others represents not merely a tactical approach to competitive advantage but a fundamental insight into the nature of sustainable success and meaningful achievement. By developing the internal strength and strategic clarity required for patient approaches to challenging environments, individuals and organizations often discover capabilities and possibilities that were previously unimaginable, creating not only personal advantage but also positive influence that extends far beyond any immediate competitive context.